Greenwich, Connecticut, December 18th. The wind off the Sound screams like a warning, stripping the heat from the engine before I even cut the ignition. My name is Riley Griffin, and I am walking into a massacre disguised as a dinner party. Inside that glowing colonial mansion, my brother is sharpening his smile, and my parents are preparing the lies that will strip me of my future. They think because my hands are rough from labor, my mind is soft. They think I am the prey. But they forgot that winter reveals everything eventually. Tonight, the snow will bury their legacy, not mine. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The wind came off the Sound like a razor, stripping the heat from the engine block before I even cut the ignition. It was a hard, dry snow, the kind that gritted against the glass and piled in drifts that would freeze solid by morning. My truck, a Ford F-150 with rust eating the wheel wells and a transmission that slipped in third gear, shuddered and died. It looked like a bruised knuckle resting next to the sleek manicured line of Range Rovers and Mercedes SUVs parked in the circular driveway. The estate loomed over me, a colonial monster of brick and black shutters, glowing with enough yellow light to melt the frost on the lawn, though it never did. I sat in the cab for a moment, letting the silence settle. My hands were rough against the steering wheel skin cracked from the dry winter air, and the limestone dust that never really washed out. I rubbed my thumbs over the calluses. They were good hands. They built retaining walls and graded driveways and fixed drainage issues that people like my parents ignored until their basements flooded. But tonight in this driveway they felt dirty. I checked the mirror. I had scrubbed up, put on a dark wool dress that was sensible and warm, and brushed my hair back. I looked like what I was, a woman who worked for a living, coming to visit people who owned things for a living. I needed this night to go right. The Griffin Educational Trust was dissolving. The principal was distributing to the grandchildren. For Preston, my brother, it meant a new boat or an addition to his portfolio. For me, it meant 2 new Bobcats, a down payment on a dump truck that didn't leak oil, and the ability to keep my crew on payroll through the winter freeze. It meant freedom. It meant not looking at the ceiling at 300 a.m., wondering if the bank was going to call. I stepped out. The cold hit me in the chest, sharp and clarifying. I walked to the heavy oak door and didn't have to knock. It swung open, pulling me into a wall of heat and the smell of roasting beef and pine needles. "Riley," my mother said. She stood in the foyer holding a glass of white wine by the stem. Her knuckles were white. "You're late, and you drove that thing." "The roads are bad, Elise," I said. I stomped the snow off my boots on the slate entryway. "Truck handles it better than the sedans." "Richard is already in the study," she said, turning her back. "Preston is here. Everyone is here." The house was suffocating. The thermostat must have been set to 80. It was a house designed to keep the world out, stuffed with heavy drapes, Persian rugs, and furniture that cost more than my annual gross revenue. I followed her into the great room. The Christmas tree was 12 feet tall, draped in gold ribbon. My father, Richard, stood by the fire swirling a scotch. He looked flushed, his eyes glassy. He was a man who had never done a day of manual labor in his life, living off the dividends of the fortune his father had built. He nodded at me, a tight, pained gesture. "Riley," he said, "get yourself a drink. We're about to sit." But I wasn't looking at him. I looked at the 2 wing-back chairs closer to the hearth, turned slightly away from the center of the room. My grandfather Arthur and my grandmother Rose. They sat like statues carved from driftwood. Arthur was 92. He wore a suit that was 20 years out of style but fit him perfectly. His eyes were closed, his chin resting on his chest. Rose was staring into the fire, her hands folded in her lap, trembling slightly. "How are they?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Fading," my father said loud enough that they could hear him if they were listening. But they didn't move. "Dad hasn't said a word since noon. Mom is, well, she's Mom. Here, but not here. It's a blessing, really. They won't understand much of the business tonight." I walked over to Arthur. I wanted to touch his shoulder to let him know I was there. He was the one who taught me how to read a level, how to understand the grade of the land, but he looked so small now, swallowed by the leather chair. I felt a pang of grief, sharp and sudden. The man who built the empire was now just furniture to his son. Riley. The voice came from behind me, smooth, cultured. I turned. Preston stood in the doorway of the dining room. He wore a cashmere sweater that looked soft enough to sleep in, and slacks with a razor crease. He held a crystal tumbler of bourbon. He looked at me with that familiar expression, a mix of pity and amusement. "Hello, Preston," I said. "You look sturdy," he said, stepping forward. He didn't hug me. We hadn't hugged since we were children. "How is the landscaping, digging holes?" "Building foundations," I corrected. "Business is steady." "Steady," he echoed, testing the word like it was foreign. "That's good. Listen before we go in for dinner. Walk with me for a second, just to the library." I looked at my parents. They were refilling their drinks, pointedly ignoring us. The air in the room felt tight, pressurized. I nodded and followed Preston down the hall to the library. It was cooler here, smelling of old paper and leather. Preston closed the door. He took a sip of his bourbon and set it down on a coaster. "We need to talk about the trust," he said. "We talk about it at dinner," I said. "That's the arrangement. Grandfather insisted." "Grandfather doesn't know what day of the week it is, Riley," Preston said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope. He held it out to me. "Look, Mom and Dad and I. We've been talking. We know things are tight for you. The economy, the labor market. It's tough for people in your sector." I didn't take the envelope. "What is this?" "It's a check," he said. $5,000, a gift, from me to you." "Why?" "Because we want you to be comfortable," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tonight is going to be technical, complicated, financial structures, tax implications. It's going to be boring and frankly a little embarrassing for you. We're going to be discussing the future of the estate, and we don't want you to feel inadequate." I looked at the envelope, then at his soft manicured hands. The implication hung in the air like smoke. They didn't want me at the table. They didn't want me asking questions. "You want me to take $5,000 and leave?" I asked. No, stay for dinner," Preston said quickly. "Just don't worry about the business talk. Let the adults handle the finances. You take this, buy yourself something nice. Maybe fix that truck of yours so it doesn't look like a salvage title in the driveway." My stomach tightened. It wasn't anger exactly. It was clarity. They had a plan. This was the pregame, the attempt to sideline me before the whistle blew. If they were offering $5,000, it meant they were trying to steal $1 million. "Put it away, Preston," I said. "Riley, be reasonable," he said, his smile faltering. "We're trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From the reality of the situation," he said, his eyes hardening. "You're a laborer, Riley. You're not a manager of capital. Dad agrees. We all agree. Take the help." I stepped closer to him. I smelled the bourbon on his breath and the expensive musk-heavy cologne he wore to mask the fact that he sweated when he was nervous. And he was nervous. "I don't want a gift," I said. "I want what Arthur put in the trust for me. I'm staying, and I'm listening to every word." Preston stared at me for a long beat. He shoved the envelope back into his pocket. The mask of brotherhood slipped, revealing the sneer underneath. "Fine," he said. "Do it the hard way. But don't say I didn't try to warn you." He turned and walked out, leaving the door open. The sound of silver clinking against china drifted down the hall. Dinner was served. I took a breath, steeling myself against the heat and the noise, and walked back toward the lion's den. I wasn't leaving until I got what was mine. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and velvet, lit by a chandelier that cast fractured shadows against the flocked wallpaper. We sat at the long table, a slab of dark wood polished to a mirror shine that reflected the distorted faces of the people eating around it. The service was formal. A hired girl I didn't recognize moved silently around the perimeter, placing plates of prime rib and roasted root vegetables in front of us. The meat was rare, swimming in a dark juice that smelled of thyme and iron. The silver was heavy in my hand, cold and substantial, the kind of old money weight that tired your wrist if you held it too long. I sat across from Preston. He ate with precise surgical movements, dissecting his beef into uniform squares. Beside him, his wife wasn't present. She had stayed home with the children, so the empty chair served as a buffer between him and our mother Elise. At the head of the table sat Richard, my father, and at the far end facing him was Arthur. Rose sat to Arthur's right. They looked small against the high-backed chairs, like children allowed to sit at the adult table for a special occasion. Arthur was focused entirely on his plate, sawing at the meat, with a tremor in his hand that made the knife scrape loudly against the china. Scree, scree, scree. It was the only honest sound in the room. The conversation was a steady, shallow stream, mostly flowing between Richard and Preston. They talked about things that didn't matter to avoid talking about the one thing that did. "The club is raising the initiation fee again," Richard said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. 10% hike. They say it's for the new irrigation system on the back nine, but I suspect it's administrative bloat. "It keeps the riffraff out, Dad," Preston said. He took a sip of his wine, a deep red Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly truck insurance. "Price signals quality. We're paying for the exclusivity as much as the greens. Besides, I got Bennett into the junior sailing program. You can't put a price on that network. He's 6, and he's already making friends with the senator's grandson." "Smart," Elise said. She wasn't eating. She was watching me. Her eyes were hard, scanning my face, my dress, the way I held my fork. "Networking starts in the cradle now. You have to position them early. Isn't that right, Riley?" I looked up. The question was a trap. "I wouldn't know, Mother. I don't have children." "No," she said, letting the word hang there. "You don't. You have projects." "I have a business," I said. I cut a potato. It was perfectly roasted crisp on the outside. "We finished the retaining wall on the Miller property last week. It's good work." "Labor," Preston corrected softly. "You have labor. Business implies scalability, strategy. Digging holes is just activity." "It pays the bills," I said. "Does it?" Elise asked. She picked up her wine glass, her fingernails clicking against the crystal. "Does it really?" The tension in the room spiked. Richard cleared his throat, a loud guttural sound that signaled the end of the pleasantries. He signaled the serving girl to leave. She vanished into the kitchen, the swinging door settling with a hush. We were alone. The heat in the room seemed to rise. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my spine under the wool dress. "All right," Richard said. He placed his hands flat on the table. "Let's not dance around it. We're here for the trust distribution. Dad, Arthur." He raised his voice, pitching it loud the way one speaks to a slow child or a foreigner. "Dad, we are discussing the trust now." Arthur didn't look up. He kept cutting his meat. Scree, scree. He put a piece in his mouth and chewed slowly, his jaw working with mechanical deliberation. Rose stared at the centerpiece, a sprawling arrangement of holly and white roses, her eyes vacant. They were ghosts in their own house. "He can hear you, Richard," I said. "He's old, not dead." "He's checked out, Riley," Preston said. "Dr. Evans said his cognition is sliding. It's intermittent. Some days he's there, some days he's in 1955. Look at him. He's just focusing on the mechanics of eating." Richard ignored me. "The Griffin Educational Trust," he announced to the room, though he was really speaking to the recording device I suspected was running in his pocket, or perhaps just to his own conscience. "Established 25 years ago to ensure the prosperity and stability of the grandchildren, to reward excellence, to protect the legacy." He looked at Preston, beaming with pride. "Preston has upheld that legacy. Yale undergrad, Wharton MBA, a vice president at dangerous age of 32, married 2 children, a pillar of the community. The trust was designed for this trajectory." Then he turned to me. The smile vanished. His face went slack, composed into a mask of tragic disappointment. "And then there is Riley." "I went to college," I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I did 2 years at UConn before I transferred to the trade program. I have a degree in landscape architecture and construction management. I own my company. I have zero debt. Lies, Elise said. It came out like a hiss. She reached under her chair and pulled out a leather portfolio. It was thick. She slammed it onto the table, rattling the silverware. It's all lies, she said, turning to shout at Arthur and Rose. She is lying to you, Arthur. She is not a businesswoman. She is a liability. Arthur paused. His knife hovered over the beef. Then slowly he resumed cutting. Elise opened the folder. She began sliding papers across the polished wood toward Richard and Preston, though they acted as if they had already seen them. They were performing for the head of the table. We did our due diligence, Elise said, her voice shaking with feigned emotion. Because we love you, Riley. Because we couldn't understand why you were always so desperate. Why you drive that truck. Why you live in that apartment above the garage in the industrial district. So we looked into it. She slid a piece of paper toward me. I looked down without touching it. It was a bank statement. It had the logo of my bank, the correct account number formatting. But the numbers were red. Deeply, catastrophically red. Gambling, Elise whispered. Online poker. Sports betting. It's an addiction, Riley. We know. I stared at the paper. It was a high-quality forgery. The dates aligned with periods where I had been working 18-hour days. This is fake, I said. I looked up at her. I don't gamble. I've never placed a bet in my life. Denial is the first stage, Preston said solemnly. He reached for another paper from the pile. We have the emails, Riley, from the creditors, the loan sharks in Bridgeport. You owe $40,000 to people who break kneecaps for a living. That's why you need the trust money, not to buy equipment, to pay off criminals. He slid a printout across the table. It was an email thread purportedly from a Vinny at a collection agency threatening legal action and physical harm. The timestamps were from last week. This is insanity, I said. I felt the anger rising heavy and hot in my stomach, like I had swallowed a stone. I gripped the edge of the table. The wood dug into my palms. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to throw the wine in Preston's smug, soft face. But I didn't. I remembered Arthur's lessons. Watch the grade. If the ground is unstable, don't build. Wait. I took a sip of water. The ice clicked against the glass. The cold shock helped ground me. You forged these, I said. Why go to this trouble? We didn't forge anything, Richard barked, slamming his hand down. How dare you? We are trying to save you from yourself. If we give you your share of the trust, $500,000, it will be gone in a week. The creditors will take it, or you'll lose it on a hand of blackjack. We cannot allow Griffin money to vanish into the gutter. Elise turned to Arthur again. She stood up and walked to his end of the table, leaning over him. She spoke loudly, enunciating every syllable. Arthur, she is sick. She has a gambling problem. She is in debt. We cannot give her the check. Arthur didn't look at her. He took a bite of a carrot. He chewed, swallowed. He took a sip of his water. He wiped his mouth. He seemed completely encapsulated in his own world, a senile old man enjoying a free meal. So here is the solution, Preston said. He pulled a document from his jacket pocket. We have prepared an amendment to the trust distribution. It's a stewardship agreement. He slid it toward me. The logic is undeniable, Preston continued. My children, your nephews, have their whole educational futures ahead of them. Private school, Ivy League. It's expensive, since you have failed to utilize your education, and since you are financially compromised, we are redirecting your share of the principal to the grandchildren's trust, to Bennett and Charlie. You're stealing it, I said. Redirecting, Richard corrected. Protecting. But, Preston added, holding up a finger, we aren't leaving you out in the cold. We are family after all. The trust will pay you a monthly stipend, $2,000 a month, administered by me. contingent on you passing drug tests and providing proof of rehabilitation. We will pay your rent directly to your landlord so you can't gamble the cash. It's a safety net, Riley. It's for your own good." The room went silent. The offer hung there dripping with condescension. They weren't just taking the money, they were taking my agency. They wanted to turn me into a child, a dependent, a failure on a dole managed by the brother who had never worked a hard day in his life. I looked at the papers. The forgeries were good, but they were lazy. They assumed no one would check. They assumed Arthur was too gone to care, and I was too weak to fight. They thought the sheer weight of their combined authority, the parents, the successful brother, the house, the dinner, would crush me into compliance. 2,000 a month, I said quietly. Controlled by you. It's generous, Elise said, considering you've disgraced us. And if I refuse, then you get nothing, Richard said. We have power of attorney. We have the evidence of your incompetence. We can have you declared unfit. This is the best offer you will get. Sign the amendment, Riley. Don't make a scene. I looked at them. Richard red-faced and blustering, Elise triumphant and cruel, Preston smug and secure in his cashmere. They were so sure of themselves. They had constructed a reality where they were the heroes saving the family fortune from the black sheep. Then I looked at Arthur. He had stopped eating. His fork was resting on the edge of his plate. His hands were still. For the first time all night, he wasn't moving. The silence from his end of the table was heavier than the shouting from ours. "Grandfather," I said. Preston laughed. "Don't bother Riley. He's probably wondering where the dessert is. He doesn't understand the intricacies of debt consolidation." I ignored him. I kept my eyes on Arthur. "Grandfather," I said again. "Did you hear them?" Arthur turned his head. The movement was slow, stiff. He looked down the length of the table, past the centerpiece, past the forgeries, past the wine glasses. His eyes met mine. They weren't the watery, vacant eyes of a man lost in the fog of dementia. They were blue, cold, and terrifyingly clear. He picked up his napkin and dabbed the corner of his mouth. Then he placed it on the table. He reached for his wine glass, but he didn't drink. He just held the stem, his fingers steady, feeling the weight of the crystal. "I heard," Arthur said. His voice was a dry rattle like dead leaves skittering on pavement, but it carried. It cut through the heat of the room instantly. Preston stopped smiling. Elise froze. Richard blinked, confused. "I heard every word," Arthur said louder this time. He looked at Richard. "You said she has debt. $40,000. "Yes, Dad," Richard said, scrambling to recover the narrative. "It's tragic, but we handled it. We have a plan." "Show me," Arthur said. He held out his hand. It wasn't a request. Preston hesitated, then stood up and walked the length of the table. He placed the forged bank statement and the email printouts into Arthur's hand. "It's all there, Grandpa," Preston said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone again. "The numbers don't lie. She's in deep." Arthur took the papers. He didn't put on his reading glasses. He didn't need to. He looked at the bank statement for a long time. The room held its breath. The only sound was the wind howling outside, battering against the thick window panes, trying to get in. "Gambling," Arthur muttered. "Yes," Elise said from her chair. "It's a sickness." Arthur looked up. He looked at me. His face was unreadable, a map of wrinkles and age spots, but the eyes were sharp. He was looking for something. A flinch. A sign of guilt I didn't give him one. I held his gaze. I had nothing to hide. I was the only person in this room who had built something with my own hands just like he had. He looked back down at the papers. Then very slowly he placed them on the table next to his plate. He smoothed them out with his palm. "Preston," Arthur said. "Yes, Grandpa." "Sit down." Preston walked back to his seat and sat. He shot a glance at Richard, a quick flicker of uncertainty. Arthur cleared his throat. He looked at the serving door. "You can come out now," he said to the empty room. We all turned. The door to the kitchen didn't open. Instead, Arthur reached into his own jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a handkerchief. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was crinkled, stained with a ring of coffee, and smelled faintly of diesel and sawdust. He unfolded it. "I have a receipt, too," Arthur said. "It's a lie," I said. The words felt small in the large room swallowed by the velvet drapes and the dark wood paneling, but I said them clearly. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up and flip the table. I just let the sentence sit there on the white tablecloth like a stone. Elise let out a short, sharp laugh. She looked at Richard, then at Preston, sharing a look of exasperated pity. "Oh, Riley," she said, shaking her head. "Don't embarrass yourself further. We have the proof. Denial is just... it's beneath us. It's beneath this family." She leaned forward, her eyes glittering with a strange, frantic energy. The wine was working on her now, stripping away the veneer of maternal concern and revealing the raw contempt underneath. "This money," she said, gesturing to the room, to the house, to the invisible pile of cash that the trust represented. "This capital is for the intelligent members of this lineage. It is for the builders of wealth, not the squanderers. It is not for laborers. It is not for people who come to dinner with dirt under their fingernails and lies in their bank accounts. It is not for failures." The insult landed. I looked at my hands. I had scrubbed them, but she was right. There was always a trace of the work. A faint line of grease in the cuticle, a callus on the palm. I wasn't ashamed of it, but in this room under the chandelier, it marked me as a different species. "I didn't fail," I said, "and I don't gamble." "Enough," Richard said. He looked at the lawyer who was sitting quietly in the corner, a man named Sterling who had been the family attorney for 40 years and had said nothing all night. "Sterling, bring the amendment for her to sign. Let's get this over with before dessert." Preston uncapped a fountain pen. He held it out to me. "Sign it, Riley. Take the stipend. Go back to your apartment. We'll clean up your mess." I looked at the pen. The gold nib caught the light. It was a beautiful instrument of surrender. Then the sound came again. Clink. Arthur placed his water glass down on the table. It was a deliberate, heavy sound. He wasn't looking at the papers Preston had given him anymore. He was looking at his son. "I know about the debt," Arthur said. Richard exhaled a long sigh of relief. "Exactly, Dad. Thank you. You see, Riley? Even in his condition, he understands the gravity." "I know," Arthur interrupted, his voice rising, stripped of the wavering tremble that had been there an hour ago. "That there isn't any." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind outside seemed to stop. The fire popped a loud crack that made Elise jump. Richard blinked. "Excuse me." "The debt," Arthur said. He picked up the piece of paper from his own pocket, the crinkled, coffee-stained receipt he had produced moments ago. He smoothed it out on the tablecloth. "There is no debt. There is no gambling. There is no Vinny in Bridgeport." Preston laughed, but it was a nervous, hollow sound. "Grandpa, you're confused. We just showed you the papers, the bank statement, the emails. It's all right there in black and white." "I see what you showed me," Arthur said. He turned his head and looked at Preston. The look was terrifying. It wasn't the look of a grandfather looking at a grandson. It was the look of a judge looking at a convict. "I see paper. Any fool can print paper. I prefer to look at the work." Arthur tapped the stained receipt with his index finger. 3 months ago," Arthur said, speaking to the room but looking only at me. "I had a roof leak at the rental property on 4th Street, the triple-decker. You know the one, Richard? The one you told me to sell 5 years ago because the neighborhood was turning." Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I called a contractor," Arthur continued. "I didn't use the family name. I used a pseudonym, Mr. Henderson. I called 3 companies. 2 of them didn't answer. One of them told me they couldn't get there for 6 weeks. The last one answered on the second ring. A woman." He looked at me. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "She came out the next morning at 6:00 a.m., Arthur said. "She climbed the ladder herself. She inspected the flashing. She told me I didn't need a whole new roof, just a patch and some new shingles on the south side. She quoted me a fair price, $1,200. I felt the blood drain from my face, then rush back in a hot flush. I remembered that job. I remembered Mr. Henderson, an old man in a thick coat and a hat pulled low, watching from the porch, asking questions about the materials, about the flashing, about the warranty. I hadn't recognized him. I hadn't seen my grandfather in 3 years, and Mr. Henderson had walked with a cane and spoken with a gravelly rasp. "You," I whispered. "Me," Arthur said. "I watched you, Riley. I sat in my car across the street and I watched you work. I watched you manage your crew. You paid them cash at the end of the day and you shook their hands. I saw you pick up the nails from the driveway with a magnet sweep so the tenants wouldn't get flat tires. You didn't know anyone was watching. You just did it because it was the job." He picked up the receipt. "This is the invoice you gave me," he said. "Paid in full. Griffin Landscaping and Construction. No debt, no liens, just honest work." Arthur turned back to Richard and Elise. The atmosphere in the room had shifted violently. The air was sucked out of the space, leaving a vacuum filled with panic. "You told me she was failing," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You told me she was a liability. You told me she was drowning in vice." "She is!" Elise shrieked. She stood up, knocking her chair back. It fell onto the rug with a muffled thud. "That's just one job, Arthur. One tiny job. It proves nothing. She's hiding the debt. She's manipulating you." "Sit down, Elise," Arthur snapped. It was a command, sharp and military. Elise froze. She looked at Richard for support, but Richard was staring at the table, his face the color of ash. Arthur reached for the forged bank statement Preston had provided. He held it up to the light. "I called the bank this morning," Arthur said. "I have friends on the board. I checked the account numbers you listed here." Preston shifted in his seat. He loosened his tie. "Grandpa, you can't just privacy laws." "There is no account," Arthur said. "This number doesn't exist. It's a fabrication. A clumsy one." He dropped the paper onto the butter plate. It landed in a smear of yellow grease. "I wanted to see," Arthur said. He looked at all of them, Richard, Elise, Preston. "I told Rose a month ago. I said, they are up to something. The way you talked about her, the way you tried to keep her away from the house, I smelled it. But I wanted to be sure. I wanted to see if it was just greed. Greed is common. Greed I can understand. I was greedy once." He paused, letting the word hang there. "But this," he gestured to the forgeries. "This isn't just greed. This is malice. This is theft. You conspired to destroy her reputation, your own daughter, your own sister, to steal a few percentage points of a trust fund you don't even need." "It's not stealing," Preston blurted out. "It's asset protection. We're protecting the family." "You are the liability, Preston," Arthur said. "You look at a person who builds things and you see a mark. You look at a ledger and you see a way to cheat. You didn't go to Wharton to learn how to create value. You went to learn how to extract it from people who actually work." Preston's face went purple. "I am a vice president. I manage a $50 million portfolio." "You manage other people's money," Arthur said. "And tonight you tried to steal mine." Arthur turned to the lawyer in the corner. "Sterling," Arthur said. The lawyer stood up. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Yes, Arthur." "Did you bring the envelopes?" "I did," Sterling said. He opened his briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila envelopes. He walked to the table and placed them next to Arthur's plate. "I prepared 2 contingencies," Arthur said to the room. Option A was the standard distribution, equal shares, assuming everyone behaved with honor, assuming the lies were just misunderstandings. He picked up the first envelope. He held it for a moment, then tore it in half. The sound of the heavy paper ripping was violent. He dropped the pieces onto the floor. "Option B," Arthur said, placing his hand on the second envelope, "was in case I was right. In case the dumb old man wasn't quite as dumb as you hoped." "Dad, wait," Richard said. He stood up, his hands shaking. "Let's discuss this. We can explain. We were misinformed. The private investigator, he must have lied to us. We'll sue him. We were acting on bad intelligence. Sit down, Richard, Arthur said. You didn't hire a private investigator. You wrote these emails yourself. I recognize the syntax. You always did use too many adjectives when you were lying. Richard sank back into his chair. He looked defeated, a deflated balloon of a man. Arthur looked at me. His eyes softened just a fraction. I tested you, Riley, he said. I tested you with the roof. And I tested you tonight. I wanted to see if you would take the bait. If you would take Preston's bribe and leave. If you would scream and cry and act the child they claim you are. He nodded, a slow, decisive movement. You stood your ground, he said. You told the truth, even when it was humiliated, even when you were outnumbered. He tapped the second envelope. This is the new trust amendment, Arthur said. It was drafted 3 days ago. It was notarized this morning before you arrived. It is triggered by my signature. He took the gold fountain pen from Preston's side of the table. He didn't ask for it. He just reached out and took it. Preston watched him paralyzed. The trap is sprung, Arthur said. You walked right into it. You thought I was sleeping. You thought I was deaf. You forgot the first rule of this family, the one I taught you, Richard, before you forgot everything I ever told you. Arthur unscrewed the cap of the pen. Never mistake silence for ignorance, he said. He signed the document. The scratch of the nib on the paper was loud, definitive. It was the sound of a gavel coming down. He signed it once, then initialed the pages. He capped the pen and handed the document to Sterling. Execute it, Arthur said. Yes, sir, Sterling said. Immediately. Wait, Elise screamed. She was standing again, her hands gripping her hair. What does it say? What did you sign, Arthur? You can't do this. We have rights. We are the parents. Arthur looked at her with cold detachment. You have nothing, he said. You have the clothes on your back and the house I let you live in. And as of this moment, your lease is looking very uncertain. He looked at me. Riley, he said. Come here. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, the adrenaline beginning to crash. I walked to the head of the table. The smell of the roast beef was nauseating now. I stood next to his chair. Arthur reached out and took my hand. His hand was cold, the skin like parchment, but his grip was iron. He squeezed my hand, his calluses pressing against mine. It was a secret language, the language of work. Tell them, Arthur said to Sterling. Tell them who owns the Griffin Trust. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He was a man made of gray angles, gray suit, gray hair, gray eyes. He stood by the sideboard away from the carnage of the dinner table, holding the document Arthur had just signed. The paper was heavy, cream-colored cotton bond. It looked like a treaty. In a way it was. It was a treaty of surrender. Read it, Arthur said. He picked up his fork and returned to his roast beef, which was now cold and congealed in its fat. He didn't look at his son or his grandson. He just ate mechanically, fueling the machine. Sterling cleared his throat. The sound was dry, like paper tearing. First Amendment to the Griffin Family Revocable Trust, Sterling read. His voice was monotone, stripping the words of any emotion which made them sound even more violent. Dated this 18th day of December, effective immediately upon the grantor's signature. The room was silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Elise was standing gripping the back of her fallen chair. Richard was slumped, his face buried in his hands. Preston stared at the table, his eyes wide and unblinking, like an animal caught in headlights. Article 1, Sterling continued. Revocation of prior beneficiaries. The grantor hereby removes Richard Griffin and Elise Griffin as primary beneficiaries of the trust principal. Their interest is hereby severed. Severed, Elise whispered. The words seemed to physically strike her. She looked at Richard. Richard, do something. He's cutting us out. He's cutting us out of everything. Richard didn't move. He made a low sound in his throat, a whimper that didn't belong in a man of his size. Article 2, Sterling read. Disinheritance of specific beneficiary, regarding Preston Griffin. Preston's head snapped up. Now wait a minute. Sterling, be careful what you read into the record. Sterling didn't look up. Preston Griffin is hereby removed as a beneficiary. Furthermore, he is removed as a trustee of any subsidiary holdings. The grantor cites conduct unbecoming, specifically the attempted defraudment of a fellow beneficiary and the falsification of financial documents. "You can't put that in writing," Preston shouted. He stood up, knocking his wineglass over. The dark red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound, soaking into the fabric and dripping onto the floor. "That's libel. If that gets out, if my firm hears about that, I'm ruined. You have to redact that." "It is a legal finding of the grantor," Sterling said calmly. "It is part of the permanent record of the trust." Preston looked at Arthur. "Grandpa, please. You can't do this. I'm a vice president. I have a reputation. You're destroying my career over a joke. It was just a strategy, a negotiation tactic." Arthur kept chewing. He took a sip of water. He swallowed. "It wasn't a joke," Arthur said to the air. "It was a test. You failed." "Article 3, Sterling said, raising his voice slightly to cut through Preston's panic. "Redistribution of assets. The entirety of the trust principal previously allocated for division among the lineage is hereby assigned to the sole remaining beneficiary in good standing." Sterling looked at me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Riley Griffin," he read. 100% of the principal and accrued interest. To be transferred immediately into her sole control, free of any oversight, stewardship, or restrictions. The number hung in the air. $1 million. Maybe more with the interest. It was enough to buy the new trucks. It was enough to buy the supply yard I had been renting. It was enough to tell the bank to go to hell. It was enough to be free. Elise made a sound like a tea kettle screaming. She lunged across the corner of the table toward me. She didn't touch me. The table was too wide, but the hatred in her face was a physical force. "You witch!" she screamed. Spittle flew from her mouth. "You manipulated him. You came here in your dirty clothes and your sad little truck, and you played the victim. You turned him against his own family." "I didn't do anything," I said. I stayed seated. I felt remarkably calm. The anger I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "I just told the truth. You're the ones who printed the fake bank statements. You're the ones who lied." "It's our money!" Elise shrieked. She turned to Richard, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Richard, stand up. Fight for your son. Fight for us. That money belongs to this house. It belongs to the legacy she's going to waste it on dirt, on tractors." Richard finally looked up. His face was gray, the color of wet ash. He looked at his father. "Dad," Richard said. His voice was broken. "Please, we can fix this. I'll make Preston apologize. We'll give Riley a larger share, 20%. That's fair. But you can't give her everything. It's reckless. She doesn't know how to manage that kind of capital. She's a laborer." Arthur slowly placed his napkin on the table. He turned his entire body to face his son. The movement was stiff, painful to watch, but he did it with a dignity that silenced the room. "A laborer," Arthur repeated. He tasted the word. "You say that like it's a disease." "It's not. It's just not what we are," Richard stammered. "We are executives. We are leaders." "You are nothing," Arthur said. The volume was low, but the intensity was nuclear. "I built this house with labor. I mixed the mortar for the first foundation of the first building myself. My hands bled for this money. And you have spent 50 years softening your hands and hardening your heart." Arthur pointed a trembling finger at Preston, who was now pacing frantically behind his chair, running his hands through his hair. "You look at him," Arthur said to Richard. "You look at that thief you raised. He lied to my face. He tried to rob his own sister, and you sat there and let him. You encouraged him. You printed the papers for him." I wanted to protect the family, Richard whispered. No, Arthur said. You wanted to protect your comfort. You are a coward, Richard. You always have been. You were afraid to work, so you lived off me. You were afraid to parent, so you let Elise turn your son into a shark. And now you are afraid of the truth. Arthur leaned forward. The firelight caught the deep lines in his face. The money is gone, Richard. It's hers. Because she is the only one who knows what it costs. She knows that money is just stored energy. It's stored work. You think it's magic. You think it's a right. It is not. I will contest it, Preston said. He stopped pacing. He looked dangerous now, cornered and vicious. I'll sue. I'll claim undue influence. I'll claim you're incompetent. I'll drag this through probate for 10 years. Riley won't see a dime. I'll bleed the trust dry in legal fees before I let her have it. Arthur laughed. It was a dry hacking sound. You can try, Arthur said. Sterling, the amendment contains a no contest clause. Sterling said, not looking up from his briefcase where he was organizing the copies. Any beneficiary who challenges the validity of the trust is automatically disinherited from any other family holdings, including the real estate trust and the residual estate. If you sue Preston, you lose the house, you lose the vacation home, you lose your future inheritance from your parents, assuming there is anything left. Preston froze. He looked at Richard. Richard looked away. Checkmate, Arthur said softly. The fight went out of them. It happened all at once. The energy in the room collapsed. Elise sank back into her chair and began to weep loud, ugly sobs that echoed off the high ceiling. Preston stared at the wine stain on the floor, his hands twitching at his sides. Richard poured himself another scotch, his hand shaking so badly the bottle rattled against the glass. They were broken. The fiction they had lived in, the fiction of their superiority, their invulnerability, had been shattered by a piece of paper and an old man they thought was asleep. I watched them. I felt a strange detachment. These were the people I had spent my life trying to impress. I had wanted their approval. I had wanted them to see me. Now, seeing them like this, small, greedy, and defeated, I realized there was nothing there to impress. They were hollow. Sterling, I said, is it done? It is done, Ms. Griffin, Sterling said. The transfer order is signed. The funds will be in your business account by tomorrow morning. I took the liberty of getting the routing number from the invoice Arthur provided. Thank you, I said. I looked at Arthur. He was tired now. The burst of energy that had sustained him through the confrontation was fading. He looked smaller, frailer. He slumped slightly in his chair. Rose, who had said nothing the entire time, reached out and patted his hand. Good job, Arthur, she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken. Arthur looked at me. Across the ruins of the dinner, across the sobbing mother and the broken father and the ruined brother, our eyes met. He didn't smile. This wasn't a happy ending. It was a surgery. It was necessary, but it left a scar. He looked at me with a profound, weary recognition. He saw the sawdust in my hair that I hadn't been able to wash out. He saw the calluses. He saw the stubborn set of my jaw. He saw himself. He gave me a single short nod. It said everything. It is yours now. Do better than them. Build something. I nodded back. I didn't say thank you. You don't say thank you for a burden, and you don't say thank you for justice. You just accept it. I'm leaving, I said. Elise stopped crying long enough to look at me. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks. Just go, she hissed. Take your blood money and get out of my house. It's not your house, Mother, I said quietly. It's Arthur's. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. I picked up the bottle of wine from the table the expensive Bordeaux Preston had been drinking. I didn't ask. I just took it. I walked past Preston. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the wall, his lips moving silently, probably calculating how he was going to explain this to his wife, to his creditors, to himself. He looked like a child whose toy had been taken away, confused by a universe that had suddenly stopped obeying his whims. I walked past Richard. He didn't look up. He was drinking the scotch like it was water, trying to drown the cowardice his father had just named. I walked to the door of the dining room. I stopped and looked back one last time. The scene was like a painting. The candle wax was dripping onto the table. The food was cold. The family was destroyed. And at the end of the table, the two old people sat holding hands, watching the fire, surrounded by the wreckage of the dynasty they had built. I turned my back on them. The hallway was cold. I walked toward the front door, the bottle of wine heavy in my hand, the sound of my boots on the slate echoing through the silent house. The air smelled of pine and failure. I needed to get outside. I needed the snow. I needed the clean, brutal cold of the real world. The hallway seemed longer on the way out. The Persian rug muffled the heavy tread of my boots, absorbing the sound, just as the house absorbed the lives of everyone inside it. I could hear the chaos unraveling behind me in the dining room, the voices rising in pitch and desperation bouncing off the dark wainscoting. It sounded like a pack of dogs fighting over a bone that had already been taken away. I reached the foyer. It was empty, the slate floor gleaming under the high chandelier. I set the bottle of Bordeaux on the entry table next to a vase of white lilies that smelled too sweet like a funeral parlor. I needed both hands to put on my coat. It was a heavy Carhartt canvas jacket, stiff with cold from being left near the door, stained with grease on the cuff. I pulled it on. It felt like armor. It felt like me. Riley. I didn't turn around. I knew the voice. It was Preston. He had followed me, slipping out of the dining room while our parents were busy imploding. I buttoned the coat. 1, 2, 3. The buttons were cold metal. "Riley, stop," he said. He was breathless, frantic. He came around the side of me, blocking the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wet. The arrogance that had worn the cashmere sweater so easily an hour ago was gone. He looked stripped. "Move, Preston," I said. "We need to talk," he said, holding his hands up, palms out. "Just for a minute. Look, I know how this looks. I know what Grandpa said, but you have to understand the pressure, Riley. The market is volatile. My position, I leveraged some things. I needed the liquidity." I looked at him, really looked at him. For 30 years I had looked up to him. He was the golden boy, the one who got the grades, the one who understood the invisible rules of the world. Now, standing in the foyer of a house he would never own, he looked like a grifter. "You tried to steal from me," I said. "You didn't need the liquidity, you just wanted it." "It's not stealing, it's finance," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "And look, you won. Okay, you got the jackpot, $1 million. Do you have any idea what the tax liability on that is? Do you know how to structure the capital gains? You need a manager, Riley. You need someone who knows the system." He took a step closer, lowering his voice, trying to conjure the old conspiratorial intimacy. "I can help you," he whispered. "I can manage the fund for you. I'll waive my usual fee. We can keep this in the family. Just don't let Sterling execute the full transfer. Let me set up a trust vehicle. We can split the interest. You get the principal, I just manage the growth. It saves my reputation and it protects your asset. Everyone wins." I stared at him. Even now, with the noose around his neck, he was trying to sell me a rope. He couldn't help it. It was what he was. He was an organism designed to consume. I reached past him and grabbed the bottle of wine from the table. The glass was cool and smooth. "Preston," I said. "Yes." He looked hopeful. "You're in my way." The hope vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, ugly hatred. But he moved. He stepped aside, shrinking back against the wall. He knew finally that the transaction was closed. There was nothing left to sell. I opened the heavy oak door. The wind hit me like a physical blow. It was violent and clean, carrying the scent of snow and salt water from the sound. It scoured the heat of the house out of my lungs instantly. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch clicked, a solid, final sound. The noise of the shouting inside was cut off instantly. Silence. Just the wind hissing through the bare branches of the oaks and the dry rattle of the dead leaves skating across the driveway. I walked down the steps. The snow was coming down harder now, small, hard pellets that stung my cheeks. I liked it. It felt real. It felt like the world waking me up. My truck was waiting where I left it, a dark shape under a white blanket. I walked to it, my boots crunching on the gravel. I brushed the snow off the driver's side window with my arm. The wool of my coat came away wet and cold. I opened the door. The hinge groaned metal on metal. It was a sound I loved. It was the sound of a machine that worked for a living. I climbed into the cab. The seat was freezing. The air inside smelled of stale coffee diesel and the faint, sweet scent of chainsaw oil. It smelled like work. I set the bottle of $300 wine on the passenger seat, next to a box of galvanized nails and a roll of blueprints for a patio in Darien. The contrast made me smile. I put the key in the ignition. For a second I hesitated. $1 million. I looked through the windshield at the swirling snow. I didn't see a vacation. I didn't see a new house or fancy clothes. I saw the new Bobcat T770 I had been eyeing for 6 months. I saw the hydraulics, the tracks that could handle the mud in March. I saw the new dump truck, the one with the pristine bed and the engine that didn't smoke. I saw the faces of my crew, Miguel, Sarah, Old Man Miller. I saw the look on their faces when I told them they were getting a raise. I saw the supply yard on 5th Street, the one with the heated garage bays. I could buy it cash. No mortgage, no leverage, just ownership. I saw freedom. Not the freedom to do nothing, but the freedom to do the work the right way, without the fear of the bottom falling out. I turned the key. The diesel engine caught on the second crank. It roared to life, a deep, guttural thrum that shook the frame. The heater sputtered and began to blow lukewarm air. I turned on the headlights. 2 beams of yellow light cut through the dark, illuminating the falling snow. I put the truck in gear. The transmission clunked. I'd need to fix that soon, but now I could afford the parts. I pulled around the circular drive. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to see the windows glowing with the false warmth of the fire. I didn't need to see my parents pacing the floor, or Preston weeping into his hands, or Arthur and Rose sitting in the wreckage finally content. I knew what was back there. The past. I drove past the line of luxury SUVs, the Range Rovers, and the Mercedes buried under the snow. They looked like mounds of earth, like graves. My truck, loud and ugly and reliable, rolled past them without slipping. The tires bit into the snow, finding the friction, finding the road. I turned onto the main road, the tires humming on the asphalt. The estate lights faded in the rearview mirror, shrinking until they were just pinpricks in the darkness. And then they were gone. Ahead the road was white and empty. The wind buffeted the side of the truck, pushing against me, but the truck held its line. I reached over and touched the neck of the wine bottle just to make sure it was real. It was cool under my fingers. I took a deep breath, filling my chest with the cold air from the vents. It tasted sharp. It tasted like iron. I drove north into the dark toward the work that was waiting for me. And the night was cold and clear and good. The tail lights faded into the white expanse of the Connecticut night, leaving the silence of the storm to reclaim the Griffin estate. It is a quiet end for a woman who finally found her voice in the work of her own hands. If you enjoyed Riley's journey, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.